Hi everybody! Today we are going to be looking at Content Area 6, the Art of Africa. So I will get that all set up for us. Okay, so here we are, the Art of Africa. So let's start with a little bit of background. Remember, if you don't have a notebook out, if you're not recording anything that you need to research a little bit more, that would be a really good step to help prepare you, especially with this unit that we did all the way back in January and a little in December. All right, so the Art of Africa is very interdisciplinary, very multimedia oriented, a lot of use of wood, but then a lot of other materials are incorporated in it. And a lot of the objects are not static, they are used in performance. Art also addresses the spiritual world. So a lot of times the performance, the action has something to do with connecting to this other world. Art used in ritual, same idea. And it's a good time for me to talk about the fact that Africa, although it is a continent, there are a lot of different cultures within that, a lot of different tribes, a lot of different countries, and so there are a lot of different styles and specific cultural norms within them. This is just kind of a broad generalization of some similarities that we see in most of the cultures, specifically the ones that we look at for this unit. There's this former belief that African art was static or primitive, just kind of interesting objects. Masks would be just for decoration. The understanding of what they were used for wasn't really known. And so the art objects were seen as very primitive. A lot of the stylistic points show them as very abstracted, not realistic, sometimes in a way that from a Western perspective can seem really basic, very primitive is a good way to describe it, but not very advanced. So a lot of times, even during the Renaissance, when objects were brought to Europe from Africa, they were brought in as curiosities, not really as pieces of art. And as time passed, like when we looked at our 20th century unit that we just reviewed, we see a lot of artists starting to look at the art objects and be really interested in them. They still thought they were primitive, they were using them as a starting point, but the understanding of the culture started to extend a lot more. Now African art is seen as very interactive, diverse, important. There's a lot more understanding we can get about the cultures from researching with current members of a specific culture, and then also with looking a little bit deeper into the history of the objects that we have. A lot of times history was preserved orally. Art objects were used to assist in the preservation of this history. Ancestors, there was never this like static death. Instead, there are ways that you can access a lot of the spirits through art objects, and there's a major respect for elders within most communities in Africa. There are separate roles for males and females within most cultures, but a lot of times females are seen as a little more elevated or not thought of as second-class citizens necessarily in a culture. We even see some matriarchal societies. The patrons of artists were often shamans who would actually use the objects in rituals, sometimes worshipers, and a lot of times art was made for royalty. And then obviously the colonization from the eastern side and the western side of Africa really does impact a lot of the cultural norms of tribes. A lot of the works we look at are pre-colonization, but then also there are some after too, and there's a lot of impact obviously with that, and also the slave trade with a lot of the works that we look at overall. Okay, let's look at some works of architecture. So we have two that we study in this unit. We have the conical tower and circular wall of Great Zimbabwe, which we have up top, and then we have the Great Mosque of Djenne in Mali. So architecture, if you think about the climate in Africa, there's a lot of desert areas, and so they would be creating cooler spaces, a lot of times with outdoor elements, and then also mud brick and ways to kind of ventilate. So if we start with the conical tower, we believe this was a royal residency. It's not fully known what it was used for mostly, but basically a town center. And the main part was actually this like large, really tall wall that encapsulated the part that we think is the royal residence. What's interesting about this stone enclosure is that there is no mortar used with any of the stones. So they're created and very carefully placed on top of one another. So this wouldn't be a defensive fortification. Instead, it would be probably for ritual or for some kind of royalty. We have the conical tower that we look at here. There's a belief that this might have been a grain silo or something that represented a grain silo. If you think about early cultures, specifically in this region, food would be a really important resource to keep people alive, and so food would equal power. And so by having this in this royal residence, you're kind of claiming ownership over that trade. So yeah, we think this is a royal residence, also trading center. There are multiple different areas, some higher up on a hill and then some lower down, all that make up this area in Great Zimbabwe. If we move on and we talk about one of my favorites, the Great Mosque of Djenne, it's a really interesting mosque. It's got some similarities to other mosques we've looked at. So if we look at this overhead image here, and I believe you have a map that you could see on the exam as well. We have a courtyard on one side, and then we have this area here, which is basically a hypostyle mosque. So we've looked at others similar to that. The one in Cordoba is very similar. This one just has an angled, it's not exactly a rectangle. There are these three main towers at the front. Two of them are minarets to call people to prayer, and then the central one is actually the mihrab, which, remember, that is the point towards Mecca. So when people would be inside praying, they would point or pray in the direction of this specific tower. Now, some other important elements of this, it's made of mud brick, so it's something made of like adobe and straw that needs to be recovered and replastered every year. So they add a white kind of plastering over the surface of it. That protects it from the elements. Mud brick is very susceptible to all of the elements, and so the mud brick covering is a really, really important part of this Islamic mosque. It's actually something that there's a huge ceremony and festival yearly, and that's where people come. They climb up the sides using all of the wooden pillars that are kind of decorative, but they also help as a ladder, and people would actually work on plastering the entire side. Now, some other unique elements. Outside of the Islamic tradition, this is more of an African tradition, there are ostrich eggs right at the top of each of these towers, and those were symbols of fertility and also purity. There's also these long vertical elements. Those fluting elements would help to get rainwater off of the surface quicker, which is important in a structure that can collapse easily because it's made of such a unique material. This is a piece that has been rebuilt many times over. If there were wars going on or people didn't have the time to take care of the surface, then it's something that would have collapsed and they'd have to rebuild it again. And currently, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but there's also a lot of civil unrest in the area. There's a lot of environmental changes. There's a big river that floods often. And then also there's a lot of urban development around it, which all of those things are possibly concerning to the life of this giant mud brick important structure. So just some little background there. All right, let's talk about African figural sculpture. Some similarities that we see across cultures. A lot of times the objects are portable, so small enough that they can be moved. Wood is used mostly. A lot of times other materials are mixed with it, or there's like an oil rubbing on the surface that kind of protects the wood and keeps it lasting longer. Metal in figural sculpture and in most sculpture is reserved for royalty. Figures are stylized, so a lot of times things that are emphasized are things that, from a Western perspective, may seem a little bit funny. So the head, a lot of times the head is really, really stylized and large, but the feet and the arms and the fingers and toes are really, really small. And that shows just the importance on the mind and the head and the appearance of that specific feature. Other things, the sexual characteristics. So a lot of times the genitalia, the breasts, even the belly button are things that are really emphasized. And that kind of shows an importance on fertility and procreation in the cultures. Okay, so here are a bunch of the works that we're going to talk about. We'll start with the Ndop figure up top here. And we talk about this one. It's a commemorative portrait of the king, the Kuba. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. And this represents the king after his death. So after his death, this would be created. This is a depiction of one of the kings in his ceremonial dress, and it's just kind of an image to help you understand the sculpture a little bit more. So the sculpture would have been created after his death, and it kind of contains his spirit. So this is a great one to compare with King Menkara and Queen. Think of the Ka statue. It's something that after the death contains that spirit, and it's something that can be activated by rubbing oil on it. The oil protects the surface of the statue, but it also helps to bring the spirit of the king back to modern day. So this would be something that would be kept in the palace. Other royalty might use it. A lot of times they talk about during childbirth, they might bring it out to bring the spirit of the king to help protect during that specific process. And so one other thing contextually with this photograph, the costume that we see there are elements of it kind of highlighted in the sculpture. And that costume probably weighs like 185 pounds, very, very heavy. A lot of times it would be buried with the king when he did pass away, kind of similar to pharaohs, how they would have a lot of their objects buried with them as well. And it indicates all of those extra ornamentations indicate their wealth and their power. To show which king it is in the sculpture, they would have objects down here. So we see a drum down here, and all of those things would indicate who the specific person is as well. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the reliquary figure, the Bieri. So remember, if we think about our Romanesque and Gothic works, we learned about relics of saints and how they'd have these elaborate reliquaries to contain the objects. So this is a reliquary figure. He would sit on the top of a cylindrical box, something that could be carried because the Fang people were nomadic. And he would sit and protect the objects within. Now the objects within would be bones of important clansmen, ancestors, things like that. And he would protect against any outsiders, but then also against the gaze of women and young boys. They were not allowed to look at the objects within this reliquary. The belly button is definitely highlighted, as well as the genitals. So these are things that indicate life. And we also can notice the hands are almost clasped in prayer, and there's a really calm face. This is something that shows the value of this calm kind of persona in the group, and also just the idea of death. All right, let's move on to the Ikenga here. This would be a shrine figure. A lot of times these were given to young males as kind of a coming of age, but they would also be things that would be older men would have as well. Sometimes you might start with a smaller Ikenga with limited symbolism, and then as your achievements grow, you might get one that's more complex, larger, has more design elements to it. So there's a strong right arm with it. This one doesn't really appear to have arms, but a lot of times they do have this really strong right arm, which indicates the physical strength. The horns also are a symbol for that physical strength, and it's a very masculine form. There's a lot of harder edges. It's also carved from a harder wood. This would be something created for a specific person, so it couldn't be used by other people. It would just be for that one man or young boy coming of age. And it would be blessed before use. So this would be something that would be kept in the home, and also blessings would be given to it before major events. All right, and then the last one, which I love on this page, is the power figure, the Nkisi Nkandi from the Congo peoples. This one's made of wood with lots of wooden or metal elements driven in. Sometimes are nails, sometimes they're blades. Remember, this one has a spirit inside of it. The creation of this object and the use of the object was reserved for specific people, kind of a shaman who could activate the object. And it would be used kind of like a current day voodoo doll. So this would be something that you could go to the shaman and you could ask them to drive nails in to preserve your own health, or to encourage better health for a loved one. So it could be used in a really positive way. It could also be used in a negative way and say to hurt one's enemies. So there's this positive negative, but it's all about connecting to the spirit that would be inside of this, or the spiritual world, to help bring about luck and good fortune or harm through it. Also, if you notice where the belly button is, there's this little shell. This would be a place where different medicinal items, some powders would be rubbed, and it would be something that would help with the performance and make a more rich outcome of the object. these would be things that would be kept by that specialist and then used by a community for lots of different reasons. And the more nails, the more use it has in it. All right, a couple other sculptures we're going to look at include the wall plaque from Oba's palace, and then the veranda post from the Yoruba people. So first, let's look at the wall plaque. We have this brass image up here, and here's an image of the king below. Okay, just to kind of give you some contextual knowledge. You can see there's a really elaborate costume on the king, and you can also see that we have these coverings protecting the king by two people that are serving him. In the same way, it's depicted right up above here. So this wall plaque was made of brass. It's created using the lost wax process. So if you think of the seated boxer, similar style of process. And there were over 900 of these plaques made. They would have gone in the palace on wooden pillars, so they would have covered all of them. And now these are not left in that position. I think the palace has been destroyed, and so they have lots and lots of these in museums all over the world. So you've probably seen some before. Some other details, they would be decoration, but they also record court life and important parts of the history of the Oba. So the Oba is the word for the king and his palace. So for instance, this is the procession of the king, showing him being shielded, which was just reserved for the king, and showing him with the ornamentation. We also see specific hierarchy of scale. So the Oba is shown much larger than the other characters. And once again, we're seeing the heads that are really enlarged. A lot of the facial features are much larger than they would actually be. And these are things to highlight the importance of that part of the figure. Yeah, so I think that's all for that one. Let's talk about Olo of Ice's piece, the veranda post with enthroned king and senior wife. All right, so this is also kind of a narrative about an important part of the culture of the king and court life. So we have the king who's seated here, and we actually have his senior wife who is shown a lot larger than him. So if you think about hierarchy of scale, it's showing her importance, not necessarily saying she's more important than the king, but showing that there's more of this equality, and as the senior most female, she's really highlighted. Also down below, we have what is believed to be a lesser wife, shown in a much smaller scale, so just really highlighting that power structure. Now she's shown behind the king because this is a part of a ceremony where she would be crowning the king. This would be a painted object. We can still see some of the remains of the paint on it. And it's an impressive piece because there's a lot of negative space. This is carved out of wood with a lot of that extra space. And this specific artist, you'll notice we don't really have the name of other artists with a lot of our other pieces. He created quite a name for himself and stood out as one of the really famous artists from this time period, the early 20th century. He had this specific style and was just well known and created a lot of work. So we see this very specific elaborate crown. We also see highlighting of the facial features, really abstracting and stylizing what we see. And once again, highlighting important elements such as the breasts to show the life, to show the fertility. Abstraction was something that was used by artists very freely. They weren't trying to be realistic in their depiction of the people. All right, let's move on. We're going to look at our 4 African masks that we have to talk about. So let's start with the Bundu mask right at the top. This is by the Cnt Society of the Mende people. So the Cnt Society was a group of women, older women, elders in the community who would help to raise and teach younger women how to be, how to act, and their roles. And so it's a wooden mask. In this case, it's a really dark wood and then it's polished so that it's got this really nice shine, kind of mimics a dark skin tone. We also can see there's a lot of hair down below. The mask would actually be worn as a helmet up top, and then the hair would cover the face. It would be worn as a part of a performance where the members of the Cnt Society would actually dance with the masks, and they'd have full body covering, so you really couldn't see any of the women. And this would be to honor the coming of age of the females in the community. Each mask was done very individually. All of the details really highlight the importance of beauty in the culture. So we have an abstracted face here. We have a high forehead, which was seen as positive. We also have the elaborate braiding of the hair here. And then neck rolls were something that showed that you had enough to eat, that you were a strong person in a position of power. All right, moving on. Our next mask we'll talk about is over here. We'll talk about the Aka elephant mask. This is elaborately covered in beading. So the mask part here would go over the face, and then this would hang down in the front, and there's also another panel that would go down in the back, kind of in front of the body. It would be worn with an entire costume. And the elephant was seen as a really important, powerful animal. So it was a status symbol. The Elephant Society would be the ones that would perform these masks. There would be lots of different ones, and they would perform them for the king on special occasions. So they would honor the king, connecting him to the idea of this elephant being very powerful. All of the beadwork, which is really, really intense, these are tiny, tiny beads making up the whole piece, also shows power because of the amount of time and detailing in it. And you can see it's a very abstracted form of an elephant. We have the trunk coming down, we have the ears, which are just basic circles. But remember, they're not striving for realism. Instead, they're striving to have the mask just kind of be this abstracted representation. All right, let's move down. We'll look at the Mableau mask next here. It's a portrait mask right down below. So this would have been a performed mask as well, used in performance. In this case, it wouldn't ever be for decoration, so it would be kept out of sight, wouldn't be on a wall or anything when not in use, so really just used for that performance. This specific one we know was carved for a senior female, so it's supposed to represent that woman. And it would have been danced by her husband and then also her sons after that. Now, this specific woman liked to dance alongside of the man wearing the mask, but most of the time it was just a celebration of that person, and so the men would dance them. A lot of the stylistic elements are really geometric. We have this kind of abstracted crown, elements to kind of indicate hair, and then we have possibly some elements that indicate scarification. All of them are showing this abstracted form. They're showing inner beauty. So the women or the people that would have these masks made for them were pillars in their community. They were seen as really good, honorable people. And so all of these stylistic elements just go to speak to the good of that specific person. All right, and our last mask we have is our Chokwe mask. This would be the female mask, the Po mask, and it indicates ideal female beauty as well. So this would be also performed by men in a ritual ceremony, and it's all to honor women. The Chokwe were a matriarchal society, so females were the leaders, and a lot of the elements that we see kind of indicate what they thought of ideal female beauty. The really dark, smooth skin, the large, large eyes that we see, a lot of the detailing in the hair, all of these things are indicating the beauty that a female would have. All right, so those are our masks. Let's move on. And I don't know if I talked about this. Lots of wood and mixed media, part of costume, and also becoming a spirit, connecting with the spirit world. Most of them have that kind of spiritual connection when they are performed. All right, let's look at our last two for this unit. These are some African art objects. So the first one, the Lukasa, this is recording oral history, so it's read by a specialist. The stool, which we see over here, the golden stool, this is an object that represents an important part of a lot of African cultures. The stool would be something that would be unique to an individual in the home, and only you would sit on your stool. It would be something that you could take and use in multiple different settings, when you're eating, when you're working, but it would be an important object to an individual. This specific stool is covered in gold, and nobody sits on it whatsoever. Instead, because of its elaborate royal covering, it is associated with the king and basically the soul of the Ashanti nation. So the Ashanti people believed that the soul was kept and housed in this stool. So the stool always had a throne that it would sit on, would never touch the ground, and the only person who could touch it would be the king. So you can see it in this picture here. It's sitting beside, it's sitting beside the king, right next to him here. And here's a better picture of it. It's on its side as well. Okay, so what's interesting about it is in around 1900, there was a war over this stool. Basically, the British were coming and working on colonizing and creating a sovereignty. And one of the British ambassadors requested being able to sit on the stool to show a connection to the Ashanti people, which was considered so disrespectful and so inappropriate, created a lot of chaos and a lot of disrespect among the people. The Ashanti people, they live on the Gold Coast, so it's a very rich in gold area. So you can understand why the British were coming to this specific area. But to this day, the stool is something that the Ashanti people keep to themselves. It's a really important status symbol of their whole culture. Going back to the Lukasa for a minute, this would be something read by a specialist, as I said. All of these different little elements would indicate different things about the history of the people. So only this specific person would be able to read and understand. Other people might be able to feel the details, but they wouldn't understand what they meant. And it could be something that talks about wars or past kings or past events that impacted the culture. The Mbonde society, they would be the people that would be able to interpret such an object. And a lot of times they have this hourglass look. Made of wood, but sometimes they have different shapes too. And they're handheld. They're something that could be held and felt by the interpreter. All right, lastly, just a reminder, these are two of our global prehistory works that come from Africa, so that there's some kind of nice connections when we look at the figurative work here, the hierarchy and scale, the abstraction, and then also these would both be painted on stone, early depictions. We'll talk about them more in our prehistory unit, but I just wanted to point that out. Some things for you to consider with continuity and change. Why does ceremony and performance play such a dominant role in the societies of Africa? Why are the roles of women more elevated, even if separate from men, when compared with other areas of the world? Why do artists use inaccurate proportions and features in the representation of human form in African art? And how has colonization impacted the work we see in Africa? How has the export of African goods impacted artists globally? All right, I hope you enjoy and have a great day, everyone.